Chapter 1, The Arrest. It was a sweltering afternoon in the heart of the city, and the streets buzzed with the usual rhythm of urban life. People shuffled about, cars honked impatiently, and the distant wail of sirens was as constant as the hum of electricity running through the towering buildings. But there was one corner of this vast city that was about to become the focus of everyone's attention, a small, unassuming restaurant nestled between a row of shops. The restaurant, Hale's Diner, had long been a staple in the neighborhood. To the untrained eye, it was just another spot serving greasy food and cold drinks to locals. But for years, rumors had swirled about the management's discriminatory practices. Stories had surfaced of how certain patrons were refused service, of how black and brown customers were treated differently than their white counterparts. These stories, however, had always been whispered, never quite making the leap from rumor to public scandal until today. Outside the restaurant, a man named Jamal Williams, a black man in his early 30s, stood on the sidewalk, frustration etched across his face. His clothes were stained from working long hours at a nearby factory, his hands calloused from hard labor. He had just been forcibly removed from the diner, his only crime being the color of his skin. He had simply walked in, sat down, and asked for a cup of coffee, but the manager, a wiry man with thin lips and cold eyes, had refused to serve him. "You need to leave," the manager had said, his voice low but firm, as if this were a routine matter. "We don't serve your kind here." Jamal had protested, of course. In a world that was supposedly moving forward, he refused to be treated like this. He had every right to be there, every right to order a meal just like any other customer. But the manager had called the police, and now two white officers, Officer Carter and Officer Reynolds, stood in front of him, their expressions unreadable beneath their dark sunglasses. "Sir, you need to calm down," Officer Carter said, his tone placating but with an undercurrent of impatience. His hand rested casually on the baton strapped to his waist. Jamal could feel the heat of the sun on his neck, but the real heat, the kind that burned deep in his gut, came from the injustice of the situation. "Calm down," he repeated, incredulous. "I didn't do anything wrong. All I wanted was a damn coffee." Reynolds, the younger of the two officers, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the small crowd that had begun to gather around them. People were watching, some with phones raised, recording the scene, others whispering to each other, but none daring to step in. "We got a call about a disturbance," Carter continued, his voice steady. "You're causing a scene." Jamal clenched his fists, trying to control the anger rising in his chest. "I'm causing a scene. You're here because they don't want a black man sitting in their restaurant. That's it. That's the whole damn story." The officers exchanged a glance, the kind that said they'd heard this all before, that they were tired of hearing it. Reynolds finally spoke up, his voice more uncertain than his partner's. "Look, man, maybe it's best if you go somewhere else, all right? We don't want any trouble here." "Somewhere else?" Jamal spat the words back at him. "Where exactly am I supposed to go where I won't be treated like this? This is America, right? Or did I miss something?" The crowd grew thicker, and the tension in the air was palpable. Jamal's voice rose as he continued, unable to keep the anger from spilling out. "This is what you do, right? You show up, you protect them, and you expect me to just walk away like I don't matter, like I'm invisible." Carter stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You need to lower your voice and step back. Now." But Jamal couldn't stop now. The injustice of it all was suffocating, the weight of every racial slur, every slight, every moment of inequality he had endured in his life pressing down on him. "No," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "No, I'm not stepping back. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here, because this is my right." Before anyone could react, Carter grabbed Jamal's arm, yanking him forward with a force that made him stumble. Jamal resisted, pulling his arm away, but in seconds, both officers were on him, forcing him to the ground. The scene exploded into chaos. People shouted, some filming, others calling out for the officers to stop. Jamal struggled beneath them, his face pressed into the hot concrete, his arms twisted behind his back as Carter slapped the handcuffs onto his wrists. "I didn't do anything," Jamal yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I didn't do anything wrong." But it didn't matter. To the officers, to the management of the diner, to the system that had let this happen, Jamal was just another black man causing a disturbance, another problem to be dealt with, quickly and quietly. As the officers hauled Jamal to his feet, dragging him towards their patrol car, he looked out at the crowd. He saw the faces of people watching, some sympathetic, some indifferent, and a few even satisfied with what was happening. And then he saw a familiar face, the manager of Hale's Diner, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips, and in that moment, Jamal understood. This wasn't just about him. This was about something much bigger, something much deeper, something that had been festering in the soul of the country for far too long. It was about power, and who had it, and who didn't. It was about control. As the police car door slammed shut behind him, Jamal's mind raced. He knew this wouldn't be the end. He wouldn't let it be. He couldn't. This moment, this arrest, this was just the beginning. Chapter 2. Behind closed doors. The small police precinct was quiet, save for the sound of the buzzing fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of papers. Jamal sat in a holding cell, his head resting against the cold, concrete wall. The adrenaline from the arrest had faded, leaving behind a heavy feeling of defeat. His wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, and his mind replayed the events of the day over and over again. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there when the door to the precinct opened, and Detective Sarah Monroe walked in. Unlike the officers who had arrested him, Monroe was different. She had grown up in the city, a daughter of working-class parents who had taught her the value of justice and fairness. She had joined the force to make a difference, but over the years, she had seen more than her fair share of corruption and prejudice within the system. Monroe had been assigned Jamal's case after the arrest report landed on her desk, and as she read through the details, something didn't sit right with her. The description of the disturbance didn't match the reality she knew all too well, how often simple things like a black man ordering a meal could escalate into something much darker. She approached Jamal's cell, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Jamal looked up as she stood in front of him, her expression calm, but with a hint of something he couldn't quite place. "Jamal Williams?" she asked, her voice steady but not unkind. "Yeah," Jamal muttered, his voice rough from hours of silence. "I'm Detective Monroe. I've been assigned to your case." Jamal let out a bitter laugh. "Great. What's the charge?" "Ordering coffee while black." Monroe didn't flinch. She had heard that tone before, the hardened sarcasm of someone who had been let down by the system too many times to count. "I read the report," she said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from him. "And I have some questions." "Let me guess," Jamal said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You want me to tell you how it was all just a misunderstanding, right? That I overreacted, and the officers were just doing their job?" Monroe shook her head. "I want to know the truth." "Your truth." Jamal looked at her, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Why? So you can twist it around and make me look like the bad guy?" "No," Monroe replied, her voice firm. "I want to hear your side of the story because it's my job to get to the bottom of this. And because I believe you." Jamal was silent for a moment, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deceit. He had learned not to trust too easily, especially when it came to people in uniform. But there was something about Monroe, something in the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, that made him pause. "Fine," he said, leaning back against the wall. "I walked into that diner, sat down, and asked for a cup of coffee. That's it. Next thing I know, the manager's telling me to leave. Said they don't serve people like me. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. He called the cops, and here I am." Monroe listened carefully, her eyes never leaving his. "Did he say anything specific?" Jamal nodded. "He said, 'We don't serve your kind here.'" "And the officers?" Monroe asked. "What happened when they arrived?" Jamal clenched his fists, the memory of the arrest still fresh in his mind. They showed up and treated me like I was the problem. Told me to calm down, said I was causing a scene. But I wasn't doing anything. I was just standing there, trying to explain what happened. Then they grabbed me, threw me to the ground, and arrested me like I was some kind of criminal. Monroe sighed, leaning back in her chair. It was a familiar story, one she had heard too many times in her career. And yet, each time, it filled her with the same sense of anger and frustration. How many more Jamal Williamses were there? How many more men and women had been arrested, beaten, or worse, for simply existing in a world that saw them as a threat? I believe you, she said again, her voice quiet but resolute. But I need more than just your word if I'm going to help you. Jamal's eyes flashed with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Help me? How? Monroe leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his. We're going to take down that diner. We're going to expose what's been happening there for years. But I need you to trust me. For the first time since his arrest, Jamal felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Chapter 5. The fight for justice. Over the next few weeks, Monroe dug deeper into the Hale family's connections, uncovering a web of corruption that reached far beyond the walls of their diner. Financial records showed suspicious donations to local politicians, while complaints from former employees hinted at a pattern of discrimination and harassment that had been covered up for years. But it wasn't enough. Monroe needed more, a smoking gun that could bring down the entire operation. She enlisted the help of a few trusted colleagues within the precinct, officers who shared her sense of justice and were willing to take on the risk of investigating their own point. One night, after a long day of chasing leads, Monroe received a call from her contact, the one she had asked to dig into Hale's diner. "I've got something," the voice on the other end said, excitement lacing their words. "You're not going to believe this, Sarah. There's a file, an old file from a lawsuit that was buried years ago. It links the Hale family to illegal surveillance. They've been recording conversations, blackmailing people, and paying off officials to keep it all quiet." Monroe's heart raced. This was it, the break she had been waiting for. "Send me everything," she said, barely able to contain her anticipation. Within minutes, Monroe had the file in her hands. As she scrolled through the documents, her eyes widened. There were transcripts of conversations between the Hale family and prominent figures in the city, politicians, police officers, even judges. They had been using the diner as a front, recording private conversations of their high-profile customers, then using that information to blackmail them into compliance. This wasn't just a case of racial discrimination. This was a full-blown criminal operation. Monroe knew what she had to do. She contacted the district attorney's office, handing over the evidence she had gathered. With this new information, they could build a case not just against Hale's diner, but against the entire corrupt system that had allowed them to operate with impunity for so long. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile cases the city had seen in years. The media swarmed the courthouse, eager to report on the fall of the once powerful Hale family. Testimonies from former employees, recordings of blackmail conversations, and financial records all painted a damning picture of a family that had built its empire on fear and corruption. Jamal was called to the stand, his testimony a key piece of the prosecution's case. He recounted the day he was arrested, the discrimination he had faced, and the systemic racism that had allowed the Hale family to continue their operations for so long. His words resonated with the jury, who sat in silence as he described the pain and humiliation he had endured. In the end, the Hale family was convicted on multiple charges, including illegal surveillance, blackmail, and racial discrimination. The diner was shut down, and several high-profile figures who had been implicated in the scandal were forced to resign. But for Monroe and Jamal, the victory was bittersweet. They had won the battle, but the war against systemic racism and corruption was far from over. As they stood outside the courthouse on the final day of the trial, Monroe turned to Jamal. "You did it," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You stood up, and you won." Jamal nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, we won. But this isn't the end, is it? Monroe shook her head. No. It's just the beginning. Jamal looked out at the bustling city around them, the weight of the future heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. Chapter 7, New Beginnings. Weeks after the trial, the city seemed to have settled back into its usual rhythm. Life moved on, as it always did, but for Jamal Williams, nothing would ever be the same. He walked through the streets with a newfound sense of purpose, though the scars of his ordeal, both emotional and physical, were still fresh. Despite the victory in court, Jamal had to grapple with the personal consequences of standing up against the Hale family and their powerful connections. He lost his job at the factory, citing that his sudden notoriety made his co-workers uncomfortable. His landlord, after months of delay, sent him an eviction notice claiming violations in the lease that never existed. And yet, despite all the pushback, Jamal felt stronger than he had in years. As he walked past Hale's diner, now shuttered with graffiti plastered across the boarded-up windows, Jamal paused. The anger he once felt had softened, replaced by a quiet resolve. That diner, once a symbol of discrimination and oppression, was gone, but the fight wasn't over. A car pulled up beside him, and Detective Monroe stepped out, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Jamal," she called, walking toward him. "I've been looking for you." Jamal smiled, surprised. "You've been looking for me? What's going on?" "I wanted to give you something," Monroe said, handing him a folder. "It's a job offer." Jamal raised an eyebrow as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the papers inside. It was an official offer from the city to work as a community liaison, helping to address racial injustice and police reform. He looked back at Monroe, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Why me?" he asked. "I'm not qualified for something like this." Monroe shook her head. "You're exactly what we need. Someone who's been through it. Someone who's seen the worst of the system and fought back. We need people like you to make sure this doesn't happen again." Jamal hesitated. It was a huge responsibility, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. But as he looked around at the city, the faces of people walking by, going about their lives as if nothing had changed, he knew he couldn't turn it down. This was his chance to make a real difference, to ensure that no one else had to go through what he did. "All right," Jamal said, nodding slowly. "I'll do it." Monroe smiled, relief evident on her face. "Good. We'll get started next week." Chapter 8, The Ripple Effect. Jamal's first day as a community liaison was both overwhelming and eye-opening. He was introduced to activists, community leaders, and local politicians, all of whom were working together to address the systemic issues that had allowed people like the Hale family to thrive for so long. It was a world he had never been a part of, but one he quickly realized was crucial to real change. His role was to listen, to the voices that had been silenced for too long, to the stories of injustice and oppression that echoed his own experience. He sat in on meetings, attended rallies, and spoke to people in neighborhoods that had been neglected by the system for years, but as he quickly learned, change didn't come easy. The city's political machine was slow to act, and for every step forward, there were 2 steps back. Some of the same officials who had been exposed in the Hale scandal still held power, and they were determined to keep things the way they were. Jamal faced resistance from all sides. Threatening phone calls became a regular occurrence, and his past was dragged through the mud in an attempt to discredit him. But he refused to back down. He had already faced the worst, and nothing could shake his resolve now. One day, after a particularly grueling meeting with city officials, Jamal found himself standing on the steps of City Hall, his mind racing. He had been trying to push through a proposal for police reform, but it had been met with heavy resistance from the police union. He felt the weight of the system bearing down on him, as if he were trying to fight a mountain with a single stone. Just as he was about to leave, Monroe appeared beside him, her presence as steadying as ever. "Tough day?" she asked, her voice sympathetic. Jamal sighed. "They shot down the proposal. Said it was too radical." He shook his head. "It feels like I'm not getting anywhere." Monroe placed a hand on his shoulder. You're making more progress than you realize. Change doesn't happen overnight, but the fact that you're even in that room, having those conversations, is a victory. Jamal looked at her, the frustration still clear in his eyes. It doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like I'm fighting a losing battle. Monroe smiled gently. You're not. You're fighting for something bigger than yourself. And that's not something that can be measured in one day, or even 1 year. This is a marathon, not a sprint. Jamal nodded, taking in her words. She was right. The fight for justice wasn't something that could be won in a single battle. It was a long, arduous journey, and he was just getting started. Chapter 3, The System Detective. Monroe sat at her desk, the soft hum of the precinct surrounding her. Papers were strewn across her workspace, case files, statements, arrest reports. But her focus was solely on the one file in front of her, Jamal Williams. She had seen countless cases of injustice, but this one struck a nerve. Jamal's story wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of a deeply embedded problem that had plagued the city, and the country, for far too long. Monroe took a deep breath, the weight of her task sinking in. She knew that going after Hale's Diner wasn't going to be easy. The diner had been in the neighborhood for decades, owned by the Hale family, a family with deep connections in the local government and police force. They were untouchable, or at least they seemed to be, but Jamal's case could be the turning point. Monroe was determined to make sure it was. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but she wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. There was too much at stake. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Hey, Sarah. It's been a long time, the voice on the other end said, sounding both surprised and wary. Yeah, it has, Monroe replied. I need a favor. The voice paused. A favor? What kind of favor? I need to look into Hale's Diner, Monroe said, keeping her voice low. I need everything you can dig up, financials, complaints, lawsuits, anything that can connect them to something bigger. The voice on the other end sighed. You're walking into dangerous territory. You know that, right? The Hale family isn't just a local business, they have friends in high places. I know, Monroe said firmly. But I can't let this go. They've been getting away with this for too long. There was a long pause. Finally, the voice replied, all right. I'll see what I can do. But you owe me, Sarah. Monroe smiled grimly. I know. And thank you. She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew that what she was doing could cost her more than just her career. But she couldn't turn her back on Jamal. Not now. Chapter 4, Shadows of the Past. The next morning, Monroe made her way to the psychiatric facility where Jamal had been transferred after his arrest. She had spent the night poring over reports, trying to find any crack in the diner's seemingly spotless reputation, but she needed more. She needed to hear more from Jamal, about his life, his experiences, and how things had escalated to that fateful day. As she entered the sterile, cold building, the smell of disinfectant stung her nose. The facility was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the precinct. Monroe signed in at the front desk, then followed the nurse down a long hallway to the visitors area, where Jamal sat, staring blankly at the floor. He looked up as Monroe approached, his eyes still clouded with the weight of everything that had happened. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope. Detective, Jamal said softly, nodding his head as she sat across from him. You came back. I told you I would, Monroe replied. How are you holding up? Jamal let out a bitter laugh. How do you think? I'm stuck in here, labeled as crazy because I dared to stand up for myself. Monroe leaned forward, her expression serious. You're not crazy, Jamal. And I'm going to help you. But I need you to help me too. Jamal's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping back in. Help you? How? I'm going after Hale's Diner, Monroe said, her voice steady. But I need more. I need to know everything you can tell me about what happened before the arrest. Anything that can help me build a case. Jamal was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where the sun filtered through the bars on the glass. You really believe you can take them down? They've been doing this for years. And no one's ever stopped them. I believe we can expose the truth, Monroe said firmly. But I need your help to do it. Jamal sighed, running a hand through his tangled dreadlocks. All right, he said after a long pause. But this goes way beyond that diner. Monroe frowned. What do you mean? Jamal leaned in, his voice lowering to a near whisper. You think they're just a racist restaurant? There's more to it. They're connected to people in power. Politicians, business owners, cops. They've got their hands in everything. They use their money, their connections, to keep people like me down. To make sure we stay in our place. Monroe felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected something bigger was at play, but hearing it from Jamal confirmed her fears. Do you have any proof? Jamal shook his head. Not the kind of proof you need. But I've seen things. I've heard things. People talk when they think no one's listening. Monroe took a deep breath, her mind racing. If what Jamal was saying was true, this wasn't just about a single diner or a single arrest. This was about a system designed to protect the powerful and keep the marginalized silent. I'll look into it, Monroe said, standing up. But I need you to stay strong, Jamal. We're going to fight this. Together. Jamal watched her as she walked away, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Chapter 9, The community stands. Months passed, and Jamal's work as a community liaison began to show real results. The community, inspired by his story and his persistence, started to rally behind him. Neighborhood meetings grew larger, rallies became more organized, and local politicians who had once been indifferent began to take notice. One particularly powerful moment came when Jamal was invited to speak at a town hall meeting. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, many of whom had been personally affected by the injustices he was fighting to change. As Jamal stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, he felt a swell of emotion. This was why he had fought so hard, so that people like him, people who had been ignored and oppressed, could finally have a voice. That he cleared his throat and began to speak. I'm not here to tell you that everything is going to change overnight, he said, his voice steady. I'm not here to promise you that the system will be fixed tomorrow, or that the people in power will suddenly see the light and do the right thing. But I am here to tell you that we're not alone in this fight. That for every person trying to keep us down, there's someone else standing beside us, ready to lift us up. The room was silent, every eye on him as he continued. We've seen what happens when we stay silent. We've seen what happens when we accept the status quo. But we don't have to accept it anymore. We have the power to change things. And it starts with each and every one of us. There was a ripple of applause, which quickly grew into a standing ovation. Jamal stood there, overwhelmed by the support, the energy, the determination of the people in that room. It was the first time he truly felt like he was making a difference, and it fueled him to keep going. Chapter 10, A New Legacy. By the end of the year, Jamal's work had led to real, tangible changes in the city. The proposal for police reform, once deemed too radical, had finally been passed, leading to a series of new policies aimed at increasing accountability and transparency within the police force. Hale's Diner, once a symbol of discrimination and corruption, had been transformed into a community center, offering resources and support to those in need. Jamal stood outside the newly opened center, watching as children played in the nearby park and families gathered for a neighborhood event. It was a stark contrast to the day he had been arrested, the day that had changed everything. Monroe walked up beside him, her hands in her pockets as she surveyed the scene. Not bad, she said, a hint of pride in her voice. You did good, Jamal. Jamal smiled, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. We did good. Monroe nodded. Yeah. We did. As they stood there, watching the community come together, Jamal realized something important. His story wasn't just about the fight for justice, it was about the power of standing up, of refusing to be silenced, of believing that change was possible even when the odds were stacked against you. He had been arrested for ordering coffee in a diner, but that moment had sparked a movement. And while the road ahead was still long, and the fight for equality far from over, Jamal knew that he had made a difference. He had left a legacy, one of hope, resilience, and the belief that one person, standing up for what was right, could change the world. Epilogue: the fight continues. Years later, Jamal's name had become synonymous with the fight for racial justice in the city. His story was told in schools, his work honored in community awards, and his legacy cemented in the hearts of those who had followed his journey. But Jamal never sought fame or recognition. For him, it was never about being a hero, it was about making sure that no one else had to go through what he did. It was about dismantling a system that had failed too many for too long, and so, even as new challenges arose, as new battles were fought, Jamal remained at the forefront of the movement, his voice strong, his resolve unwavering, because the fight for justice never ends. And neither would he.